Welcome to another episode of Think JSOU. Here today we have Dr. David Stuckenberg. He is the co-founder of Genesis Systems and serves as the COO and vice chairman of the board of directors. Genesis Systems is a global green tech company solving global water scarcity with renewables. While serving in uniform, he worked for the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and led a special task force on the resilience of infrastructure that included water, nuclear power plant security, and our command and control systems. He has been called the George Kennan of this century by senior military leaders and a national treasure by the former Director of Central Intelligence, Ambassador James Woolsey. He holds a PhD in international security from King's College with a concentration on hybrid and gray zone warfare, and currently, to our knowledge, is the only PhD holder in the world of gray zone warfare. So welcome, Dr. Stuckenberg.
Thanks for having me, Lydia. Appreciate it.
We really want to hear more about your insights and help us understand what is the 101 of water security, and then tell us what that means for conflict, and then, what does that really mean for the SOF mission set? So over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen momentarily so I can illustrate what I'm talking about with images. Okay, thanks for allowing me to share these images. This means I get to talk less because a picture's worth 1,000 words. When we think of water, we think of it as a resource that we can take for granted. This is something that has always been free. It's always been around and accessible. But that paradigm is changing. And so recently, while I was publishing some work with Harvard, I asked them to allow me to title a journal article, Water Scarcity, the Most Understated National Security Risk on the Globe. I'm read into a good deal of programs and have held different security clearances, but in my strongest belief, I believe that water scarcity is one of the most neglected and tremendous threats to national security and stability. And after some back and forth, I was allowed to go forward with my original title. And so today I'm going to throw some images and information out that I believe will help prove the math about why water can be so disruptive, and I'm going to show the trends of what we're seeing. But ultimately, if you think about water, you can only, as a human being, go 3 days without water, right? So it is an immediate need outside of air that a human has to have. And so water is a baseline of human need. Water is a resource, obviously, that empowers economic engines. And water is unfortunately a diminishing resource throughout the world. And so I'm going to get right into it. Okay. Only I was not on my cover slide. So the mission of Genesis Systems and why our company got into the trade space is simply to really work toward stability within the national security arena, within the strategic arena where human need and society and economics come together. Solving global water scarcity is an absolute requirement. It's not something that we can play around with and hope to solve in an incremental way. It really does have to be solved. And so this lower image on the left is what we're seeing more and more throughout the world as nations encounter their water supplies literally running out. And so this is the image not far from Cape Town of the reservoir, where obviously the water supply is below the intake. Once upon a time, I gave a briefing to the head of global markets at Citigroup, and I've told this story before. But my cover slide actually had this quote on it from William Buter, who's the chief economist at Citi. And of course, it says that water will eventually become the single most important physical commodity. And what's strange is that over the last 5 to 10 years, we've actually seen this begin to develop. And so recently spoke with somebody on Wall Street, and they referred to water as blue gold. And so when something has that much value, literally the value to create life and commerce, or the absence of it, the ability to destroy and take that away, there's going to be challenges associated with it. And we need to anticipate those and understand the dynamics at play. The value of water today is that it really is a part of everything we do in an improved society or even emerging societies, regardless of where you are in the world. Everything has a water footprint. So from the standpoint of a cell phone device using 3,100, almost 3,200 gallons of water, or the manufacturing of an automobile, this is a requirement to improve quality of life wherever you are in the world. And because water is becoming a constraint, what you see now is that Fitch and Standard & Poor's and Moody's and other credit rating enterprises are beginning to look at the sustainability of water within societies across the world to determine whether or not they should be given credit. And this is going to create a lot of challenges for nations and a lot of opportunities for others. A good example might be China has lower lending standards in many cases as part of the Belt and Road Initiative than some Western countries. So this may provide them opportunities to come in to a nation where they can't get loans and provide themselves opportunities for influence and ultimately even control. So as we look at the totality of the world right now, we've got roughly 1.8 billion people, around a quarter of humanity in water scarcity. And this number is expected to rise according to most of the data that I've looked at, whether it's from the UN and a variety of sources. And you can see that most of the water scarcity presently is actually concentrated in the belt of the earth in the most populous regions. And the challenge of this is fairly simple on its face, right? As population is increasing, the water withdrawals and the use and demand on the existing water sources is also increasing. And certainly there are, efforts to diminish water use in terms of humans. For example, Grace, which is a chemical company, has a water calculator that you can go and calculate your daily water needs based on where you live in the United States, what your eating habits are, whether or not you water your yard, have a swimming pool, etc. And a very moderate 4-person family without a swimming pool who does no irrigation in their yard and who's very careful with their water uses about 1 million gallons of water a year in Central California. So when you extrapolate this across the wider population, you begin to see the amount of demand on the water supply. So the challenge right now is that the demand curve on the lower right of the slide is increasing, but the availability is decreasing. And this is a perfect inversion, if you will, of what we would hope to see as we improve society around the world. And this pinch, if you will, on the supply and the increase in demand is going to become very problematic. So when I look at water, and I don't have the particular illustration on this deck, but if you go to the World Economic Forum and you look at the top global economic risks running since 2011, in 2011, oil was replaced by water as the top 5 disruptive concern to international economies. And from then on, it has been a top 5, along with weapons of mass destruction highlighted on this slide. And why that's interesting is that obviously weapons of mass destruction is a more complex embodiment, if you will, in terms of technology. It's difficult to obtain. It's well regulated, the IAEA and treaties and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, water is actually fairly easy to disrupt. You can reach out and touch it. There's little protection on most of the infrastructure. In fact, I visited a military base very recently, and the chief engineer stated that most of the technologies in use on that facility had been in use since the 1940s. So the ability to affect people in terms of sheer number, population, if you will, order of magnitude, with water is on par with weapons of mass destruction. So that demands that we begin to think about this. And so a good example would be if I were a obtuse actor and I wanted to in some way impact the ability of NATO to project power throughout the Middle East and North Africa, for example, from the base of operations in Qatar. I can begin to concentrate my focus on the water generating capability of Qatar. And the way you do that is through the disruption of that civil infrastructure, right? So, for example, there's no significant natural resources left, or what we would call native water supplies, throughout most of the Middle East and North Africa. There's some nations like Saudi Arabia have treated those as a strategic resource. But at the end of the day, most of these populations are sustained artificially. And it's those artificial supports that can always be removed as part of the infrastructure. So the number of artificially sustained states will continue to increase, and the dangers will continue to rise, as with many pieces of the infrastructure, as you consolidate into single or network systems that can be impacted simultaneously or significantly. And that's by man-made or natural disasters. So currently, across the spectrum of technologies, there are a lot of things that deal with reduction of use. And so we would call these efficiency measures, but there's not a lot on the supply side. And that is, where do you actually find new water supplies? And so that's the concentration of my company and my research in terms of trying to locate new sources. And the reason is that the existing sources of water, lakes, rivers, aquifers, these that have been taken for granted for a long time, what we call condensed sources, these are running out. They're being exhausted because the withdrawal is greater than nature can put it back. So we're in the process of developing other technologies that allow us to access new water supplies within the hydraulic cycle. And so to continue on the points of why this is important, to give you an example, the average NATO country spends, the average NATO country is obligated to spend around 2% of GDP on their contributions to NATO and the national security defense. And this is a little dated, but this is from the World Bank. And this is the last time they actually did this analysis. But on the current projections as of 2015, this is the GDP impacts expected directly due to water scarcity. And you can see that in some places across the Middle East, that's as much as a negative 14%. That's massive. So you're looking at, right, 7x what they spend on defense in some places. And so this is something that has to be considered and that needs mitigation, and that is going to have a variety of impacts across the battle space, the operations areas around the world. From a real estate investment standpoint, in terms of land holdings, developments of hotels, properties, warehouses around the world, Blackrock, who now has more assets under management than does Goldman Sachs, projects that 60% of real estate investment trusts across the world will see high rates of water stress by 2030. So we're in 2021 going into 2022. So this is 8 years away. And you can see these heat maps show in continuing proliferation of water stress throughout the most populated areas of the world. So what are the conflict indicators that I've been seeing? They're all over, and they're unbelievable. So whether it's a diplomat calling from the Philippines or an NGO calling from Turkey, we are seeing water scarcity come to the forefront of all the concerns, and right after that, food issues. So water scarcity is defined as not having enough water to support basic needs of a society, including economic. And behind water scarcity is something called water bankruptcy. Water bankruptcy, a good example of that would be the total austerity measures recently implemented in Iran, which led to rioting and essentially loss of civil order and discipline. If you think about it from a human standpoint, if you've ever tried to hold your breath a very long time, there's a point at which your body kicks in and you cannot overcome the impulse to take a breath, right? You cannot overcome the need to gasp. Your body physically has to have air. The same thing happens with water. After a human begins to go a couple days and move toward 3 days, there is a panic and a drive. It is an instinctive drive that sets in that requires that person to seek water. And with that can become obviously a series of disruptive behaviors that give no consideration to law, order, or discipline of any kind. It's a basic survival instinct. And so as you look at around the world, the predictions over the next decade in terms of where unrest will happen, there's a lot of data that is not available because of just a lack of sophistication due to geography, right? But where those data sets are available, some of the more recent and more sophisticated research has shown that the likelihood of hydropolitical conflict over the next decade will increase by 75%. And this is quite significant. And I think also what's significant is that a lot of the areas that will show conflict here in brown are actually here in the United States. A good example for a case study is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, pictured in the lower right here. This dam is sizable, and it is at the headwaters of the Nile River, and it's located in Ethiopia, but downstream is Egypt, right? And you have other nations on the periphery here of this dynamic, including Sudan. But at the end of the day, Ethiopia is looking to elevate itself economically. And in order to do that, they have essentially created this infrastructure. The infrastructure is purported to be backed by China in terms of, I'm not sure if it's actually part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but I have been told that this is a China-funded project. And at the end of the day, Ethiopia and Egypt are approaching conflict over this project because the Nile waters are the lifeblood of Egypt. And if you talk to any senior official within Egypt, they will know to the quarter inch how much water is recycled in which provinces of Egypt, because it's that important to them. And now that balance that has been there for tens of thousands of years is being interrupted by something man-made. And so recently there was an incident where a reconnaissance force was intercepted by the Ethiopians. This reconnaissance force was sent by Egypt, and there has been threats of war over this infrastructure. And so that's what we mean by hydropolitical conflict, whether it's between India and Pakistan or in other water scarce areas of the world. Again, these are the most populous areas of the world. What does that mean? What does it potentially mean to a region like the Emirates, who most of which are dependent completely on artificial water, desalinated water, and you can potentially contaminate the primary source of their water supply, which is the Arabian or Persian Gulf, right? And so this becomes difficult because if you contaminate that water supply, all of those intakes would have to shut down until that contamination was dissolved, cleaned up, or dissipated. And again, you can go 3 days without water. So beginning to re-engineer our thinking in terms of how we think about water and not taking it for granted is one of the habits of mine that as operators in an ever-changing environment really needs to be considered. In terms of the DoD, water is a preeminent concern, but it has not yet raised itself to the level of concern where concern is met with action. This is a little unfortunate because of some of the data I'm actually going to put in front of you, but water and fuel are a significant O&M burden to the Department of Defense, and I would expect that the same is true for NATO. Only the way that it has been provisioned across time is fairly antiquated. And so, for example, on the top left here, we see a C-17 being loaded with bottled water. And so by the time you factor in the cost of fuel, that bottle of water, once you're downrange, is quite cost prohibitive. And so in 2005, the Army Corps of Engineers, this was in 2005, did a study on the cost of water to DoD, and that cost was between $5 and $500 a gallon. There's a lot of vulnerabilities introduced in the supply chain when you think about water. This, what we call camel here on the top right, is typically how water has been delivered to theater since at least the Korean and Vietnam wars. And, you know, this is a vulnerability when you have to stop a fleet or a vessel at sea to take on water from an oiler, as is happening in the lower right. That's a period of vulnerability. And so these can become force limiters, especially when you think about theater campaigns where you have the tyranny of distance, such as in Indo-PACOM. That becomes more problematic as well when you have distributed operations around smaller land masses, such as islands. So the contested operations environment in the future is going to make the logistics of water challenging. Most of us have heard it said that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. I believe that was attributable to a famous general whose name escapes me at the moment. But at the end of the day, these are Army numbers. We had 68 casualties in 2007 alone, resulting directly from the transport of water. This was in Iraq, I believe. We averaged one casualty or killed in action every 100 convoys. And so as far back as 2010, solutions were requested out of theater for point water generation, but that was not forthcoming, and the DoD has still not been able to deliver that capability in a way that really meets the need, especially where you don't have the ability to desalinate. So currently, from a infrastructure standpoint, stateside and around the world, this is JSOU numbers, there's 102 military bases running out of water. 400 active or closed bases have contaminated water due to persistent chemicals. Around 149 of those are designated Superfund sites. And there's just a tremendous water bill for many of these sites. At Al-Udeid, for example, the water bill there is about $7 million a year spent in taxpayer money to sustain just the water supply. So in some cases, you know, the issues with the water are becoming a public relations nightmare for the Department of Defense. And so these are areas that going forward, when you think about messaging and adversaries taking information and situations and bending those to their favor, these are things that we have to be smarter about in terms of how we engage. Within the public segment, industry, for example, it's really important to understand that you know, the health of a democracy is often related to the health of its economy. And if you look at the largest companies in the world, across the world, all of them have the need to, or the stated need to reduce water use, find sustainable water sources, and to try to reduce their carbon emissions and overall footprints. So tall order, but I expect the Department of Defense, combatant commands, and other fighting echelons will follow in due course, as many of the industry practices often move forward into Department of Defense, where management and those functions are carried out using best practices. Just a quick example of disruption that has occurred to an industry. So this is a bottling plant in India that was shuttered due to the fact that Coca-Cola's wells ran deeper than the adjacent farmers' wells. And the farmers' wells, due to the drop in the water table, no longer functioned. And as a result, public pressure on Coca-Cola Company required that Coke shut down that bottling operation and move. And so, local populations are not oblivious to the value of their water. They're not oblivious to what it means to them when that water is interrupted. And this is an opportunity to build trust and build stability in regions when we pay attention to these needs wherever the U.S. is trying to support life, liberty, and happiness around the world and its interests. Just a quick case study at home before I wrap up and give the questions back to Dr. Lydia. At the end of the day, water is diminishing very rapidly. And so this is one of those things where we can look at it in very abstract form and say, as a concept, yeah, we get it, water is diminishing. So are a lot of other things. There are a lot of more pressing needs. But I'd like to, again, prove the math and just note that in the United States, after the Dust Bowl, we began to mechanize our farm-to-market system as an infrastructure, and we began to artificially produce food, which allowed us to have a surplus in food exports to more than 100 countries. And a lot of that food production is supported by underground oceans, aquifers. And on the right-hand side here, what you have is actually a map from satellite imagery provided by GRACE, which is a measurement of Earth's magnetic field by two satellites that NASA has in orbit. And over time, they've measured the depletion of water in our largest basins, our largest underground aquifers, over a period of more than a decade. And what you actually see is the largest aquifer here in the Texas Panhandle area being withdrawn quite astonishingly. And if you look at the actual numbers, it's somewhere in the ballpark of withdrawal of about 3 feet of water a year from those underground aquifers. That's the total takedown, because we're pumping up into thousands and thousands of pivot arm irrigators, which are pictured here on the left hand of the screen. Those pivot arm irrigators are pumping water up at 168 gallons a minute, and then they're spraying that water out right on the crops out of those nozzles. And as that water passes through those nozzles, about 40% of it is lost to evaporation and wind drift. The other is lost to runoff, which never actually goes back into the ground because these aquifers take between hundreds and thousands of years to recharge. So as we actually look at the major agricultural producing areas of the United States, for example, there is strong concern that the ability to support future ag growth by present means is very much in question. And that means obviously a pinch on food supply, right? So what you have here is an example of one of the most sophisticated nations in the world, the United States, mismanaging its limited water supply. And so if that's what's happening in the United States, begin to extrapolate what's happening in other areas of the world. Australia, for example, throughout Africa, for example, even in South America and many of the most fertile and productive growing regions. We're seeing food supplies begin to diminish. We're seeing vineyards close. We're seeing avocado farms where all the trees are dying, and all of the arable land that is supported by what was once easy to find, easy to obtain water is evaporating literally or being used up. And so one might argue, and our CTO recently shared this insight with me, so I'll give him credit. But he said, there was a day and a time when it was easy to get oil. You could get it, if you've ever watched the movie Beverly Hillbillies, and Jed Clampett accidentally shoots at something and oil starts bubbling up. There were times when, oil gushed from the ground in the United States. And that was a time when it was, peaking, if you will. And then we saw all that supply drawn off over decades and decades of use in refineries, obviously sending that around the world. And now we're squeezing it out of sands, and we're getting it out of shale, and we're fracking to get that oil. And so the oil supply peaked, and now we're finding more and more creative ways to get it. The same can be said for water. The days of easy to get water, where it's on top of the lakes, it's easy to find it in a reasonably accessed water table, those are going away. And the future is going to have to look very different in terms of how we innovate to get the water supply. Some of the technologies on the horizon, thankfully in terms of good news, actually move us away from complex, centralized, capital-heavy models that are currently in play. This is a desalination plant, for example, right outside the city of Dubai. And you can see that it's about the size of an international airport. As you look at all of the feed streams into this plant, there's really only one that any nation is interested in, and that is the water out, that blue stream on the top right. Except a lot of the discharge that comes from these plants, also known as effluents, have chemicals, bleaches, and ultra high concentrations of salt. So I want you to think about it for a moment. If you continue to take all of the water needed to sustain the Middle East, North Africa, and some regions of the world from a body of water that is not receiving a large turnover and is not connected to larger oceans in the world. So this is especially true in seas. As that effluent begins to concentrate, you actually raise the overall salinity of the water. And this can actually hold heat, kill ecosystems, and have extraordinary environmental impact. But at the end of that, it is also another problem where you've created a Dead Sea and you can no longer desalinate the water because the concentrations of salt overwhelm reverse osmosis filters. And so as a result, you have to go to higher forms of water distillation. And that is by adding heat and essentially evaporating water off and going to distillation purification. And as a result, that too becomes problematic because it uses more energy sources of a given nation. And what's interesting is that if you look at many areas of the world in terms of culture, they expect their governments to provide water and food. And so if a government is unable to provide that, does that lead to instability of the government? It's very possible. And we've already explained some of the reasons why. In terms of where we're going in technology, from a bit of a forecast standpoint, certainly this is the technology that my company deals with. But if you'll remember a time when you needed to, if you ran out of gas in your car, for example, and you needed to make a phone call to get a ride or to get a new can of gas, at the end of the day, you had to find a payphone, or you had to go to, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, a farmer's house where there was a landline. And then then we went wireless, right? And the internet finally went wireless. And this is actually, we believe, going to happen to water supplies, where they become federated, and ultimately we begin to cut the pipe. And the way we can do that is actually, if you think about the hydraulic cycle, which is how the world works, it's always in balance. And what we can see here is actually a representation in this image of the hydraulic cycle at work. Here we have a body of water, which is actually evaporating, and that evaporation is condensing into a cloud. And that condensate, once it becomes heavy enough, is beginning to fall in rain and in turn replenish the body of water. And this is the hydraulic cycle. Some of that water goes down into the ground, of course, and other places. But at the end of the day, much of the Earth's fresh water, which only about 0.5% is obtainable, is actually held in the sky in about 37 quadrillion gallons of water. And technologies now allow us to access that water for individual or even community needs daily. And so if you can think of your daily needs as a human being, or your daily needs on the battlefield as being a cube around you, roughly the size of a basketball court, for about your daily water needs, that's your water cube. we can begin to access that now with very efficient technologies by taking that water out of the air and putting it to use where and when it's needed, no matter where you are in the world and regardless of the humidity levels. So that's kind of what our concentration is as a company. We're cutting the pipe that has been around since Roman times and the legacy infrastructure and making water available at the edge. So with that, that's some of the considerations that we look at within the geopolitical and economic construct as we look at water trends around the world. And at this time, I'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much, David. This is a fascinating conversation. Your brief really drove home the point about how valuable water is. And so my question, listening to you speak, is why do you think people just miss this threat? It seems so obvious to me.
I've asked myself that. I've been involved with the water space for around 7 years now. I think a lot of it was education. Originally, I remember starting a research company years ago that focused on developing what we call supply side water technologies. The first thing you would have to tell investors is the why, and we used to have to really dig into obscure information and try to assemble the pieces, if you will, and really kind of create that mosaic. Let the information tell the story. I don't think that's the case anymore, and I'll give you a case in point right out of Texas, in fact, which hit many close to home, who I know. And this example was shared with me by one of the leaders in San Antonio, who said that during the winter storm in 2021, when the power was knocked out, the water supply was interrupted in the city of San Antonio, which is the nation's 7th largest metropolitan area. And as a result of that, this tremendous thriving city not only ground to a halt, but the high-end tourist areas were severely impacted to the point where tourists and visitors to the city came down out of the 4- and 5-star hotels with champagne buckets and began to dip water out of the Riverwalk, which is this river that runs right through the heart of the city. And they used that to flush commodes, and they would walk back up the stairs in the hotels. And that happened in the United States. So these examples of water scarcity and disruption are happening more frequently, and there's less and less people to convince. The challenge now is how do you get to the action points? And how do you, as policymakers and decision makers, begin to head off with what we believe an avoidable disaster of extraordinary human proportions? And how do you begin to create efficient water systems that allow need to be met where the need exists, and without creating complex, large, monolithic and expensive infrastructure? This is possible. And so, but there is still a graduation that has to be done in terms of these old paradigms and what Edward Lutwyck referred to as irrational persistence with an old model. And it exists everywhere. And sometimes we don't realize that when we're stuck in a mindset that it's just a lack of information. So efforts like this to change our understanding of the paradigms and through education and through understanding are very valuable. And there's a tremendous need to have this dialogue when we're looking at contingency operations, when we're looking at the sustainment of small agile forces, wherever that application is. Water has to be, and the environmental impacts of what we're doing have to be part of the decision calculus.
Absolutely. And considering, though, as you've already explained, that lack of water can also cause conflict, and thinking about those areas in the world that you had pointed out in the map, SOF is present in all these areas. So what is it that SOF leaders can do leveraging the SOF mission sets? Two that come to mind for me are humanitarian operations and civil affairs. Could you share some thoughts about how you think that these two mission sets can be leveraged to support U.S. national interests in the various theaters that they're operating in?
Well, you almost took the words right out of my mouth. I think, I think from a U.S. standpoint, what we do in terms of supporting other national interests with military advisory roles, whatever we're doing, we really need to start with compassion and understand that if we don't, as Maslow kind of indicated, support that basic need. I'm not a firm believer that Maslow applies to everything. You can really flip that model on its head, right? It's easy to do. It depends on your belief system. But what I will tell you, if those basic needs, certainly air and water, are not met, all other predictability factors, you might as well just throw those out. And so from a standpoint of stabilization, from the standpoint of making sure that the forest is healthy, from the standpoint of making sure that there's good community relations, we need to think about water, and we need to think about long-term efforts to make sure that those sources don't become something of the easy lever that through gray zone or efforts below the threshold of war that someone can pull on. And right now they really are the low-hanging fruit. And as we continue to gear up, or I should say ratchet up in terms of the great power competition, these easy levers, these easy buttons are obviously the go-to, right? And so those are the areas that we need to look at. How do we fortify these? And what I would tell you is that if I can disrupt a nation by attacking its water supply or calling that into question or contaminating it in some way, then I can achieve a variety of goals, right? And that's what we need to think about. So in terms of SOF, there's a lot, to consider in terms of how you weed this in. One of the first things I would say is that we need to get after the competition space in a way that is determined to win. When you look across the totality of challenges around the world, when I look at the data and where competitors are competing with the United States, I would say that, in my opinion, we're treading water. We're not on a footing that says, okay, we will come out as the unquestionable leader in this current competition phase. And that's problematic, right? Because from the standpoint of the present world order, the goal is to maintain freedom. And with that, right, that is an enablement of free will so that societies and people can choose their own destiny. This model that comes beside that, this alternative, is one of coercion and force. And ultimately, larger systems and more organized systems like communism say, I will take that choice away from you, and you exist for the will of the state, and the state will choose your future. And so this is the contest. It's between these two ideological systems. And from a very practical standpoint, at the very basic human level, and especially within the lower education areas of the world and emerging societies, they're looking to see who provides the best concern for them, who's the most compassionate, who's meeting their need in a very real and tangible way. Mm-hmm. And so there's efforts, for example, that the United States has going throughout Vietnam and Cambodia to support, flooding mitigation and so forth, yellow fever reduction, various malaria programs. But at the end of the day, when actors come in and they begin to message that the United States is a hostile belligerent and is trying to take advantage, and yet all of this goodwill is going on, and that kind of narrative is not being answered, all of that goodwill that we are trying to build is canceled. Mm-hmm. And it is it's muted. And so when we do these strategies, we need to be thinking about the fact that we may put a lot of groundwork in, but if we don't address the basics, then the whole thing begins to fall apart, and we will never really achieve what we want to achieve, and that is building up people promoting a better quality of life, increasing freedom, and giving people the right to pursue their own liberty and happiness, just as we do. And so water, I believe, is fundamental to that, right? Through it, we can uplift humanity. And that certainly has been my focus, and it can be ours from a DoD standpoint if we begin integrating that thinking into what we're doing. But from a resources standpoint, the days of taking water for granted, it's just going to be that thing that's available, and we'll get it there and source it locally. Those days are over without deliberate planning.
Thank you for that. So for me, I hear this and I think, for the audience, what do we read? What should we look at? How can we keep up to date with these things? Where do we go to find out what we need to know about this? Could you give any advice or recommendations for places that anyone seeking more knowledge about this can go and continue to read up?
Sure. One of the best places I have seen is actually called circleofblue.org. It's an amalgamation of data sources from the World Economic Forum, from the United Nations, and from the largest companies in the world. They've come together to build this consortium, if you will, of knowledge, understanding. Now, companies understand that, water as a part of their supply chain, as part of literally every global supply chain, can no longer be taken for granted. And it's an education effort that they've assembled to, again, not only enrich each other, but the public as well. So Circle of Blue is a good place to start from the standpoint of, talks like this one. Now that you've heard about water scarcity, the ubiquity of the problem is now going to begin to jump out at you. You're going to notice, the obscure towns in California running out of water, sure, but you're also going to begin to see the water-related challenges and conflicts and friction areas beginning, and they're just going to begin to kind of jump out at you. So, in terms of formal courses, formal training, anything like that, it doesn't exist anywhere in the world. There's no, besides civil engineers, there's no one who focuses on technology. That's one of the biggest areas our company has had to focus is hiring young engineers and literally training them to think about water in a new way, and young scientists, and beginning to imprint on them that there's a different way to think about water in the future. So that's been a fun effort, but let's continue collaboration, and we'll be happy to provide and channel whatever insights we have to the SOF community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.